1944. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, commander of the Japanese Fourth Fleet, stood at the window of his headquarters building on Dublon Island, looking out over the vast natural anchorage that the Imperial Japanese Navy proudly called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The morning sun was already warm on the water. Dozens of merchant ships and auxiliary vessels rode gently at anchor, their gray hulls reflecting in the calm tropical blue. Oil tankers, cargo ships, repair ships, floating workshops. He had counted them many times before. Today, there were 58 operational vessels scattered across the Great Lagoon, not including the small craft and submarines that came and went with the tides. And beyond the ships, on the 5 airfields carved into the surrounding islands, more than 300 aircraft sat ready. Zeros, Bettys, float planes. Hara had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for more than 3 decades. He had stood on the bridges of battleships during the Great Fleet Reviews in the Inland Sea. He had commanded forces in the early lightning victories of 1942. He understood what strength looked like. He understood what security felt like. But this place felt different. Truk wasn't just another base. Truk was supposed to be untouchable, a fortress of coral and steel ringed by reefs that made any approach by enemy ships almost impossible. A place where the combined fleet could rest, refuel, and strike anywhere in the South Pacific. A place the Americans would never dare attack. At least, that's what every report from Tokyo had said. His chief of staff, Captain Masataka Kawamura, entered the room quietly, clipboard in hand, the way he always did at this hour. "How many vessels in total now?" Hara asked without turning around. His voice was calm, almost conversational. 58 operational ships as of this morning's count, Admiral," Kawamura replied. "Not including the small craft and submarines still expected this week." Hara nodded slowly. He kept his eyes on the water. A light breeze moved across the lagoon, barely rippling the surface. Somewhere in the distance, a seaplane engine coughed to life, then settled into a steady drone. Everything was exactly as it should be. Yet something in the back of his mind had begun to trouble him these past few weeks. The Americans. They were coming closer every month. Not in the old way, with a few carriers and a handful of cruisers. No, something larger was happening out there, beyond the horizon. Intelligence reports spoke of new ships, Essex-class carriers appearing in numbers no one had thought possible. But here, in the warm safety of Truk Lagoon, those reports still felt distant, almost unreal. Hara turned slightly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Any word from Admiral Koga at Palau?" he asked. "Only routine traffic, sir," Kawamura said. "He remains confident that Truk is secure." Hara allowed himself the smallest smile. Of course Koga was confident. Everyone was confident. The officers in Tokyo were confident. The pilots on the airfields were confident. Even the sailors lounging on the decks of the anchored ships down there seemed confident. This was the Gibraltar of the Pacific, after all. Let the Americans come if they dared. They would break themselves on these reefs just as others had broken before. Hara took one last long look across the lagoon. The ships, the aircraft, the calm blue water that stretched for miles in every direction. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 30 days, that calm blue water would disappear beneath American steel and American wings. He didn't know that the peaceful scene before him was about to become one of the most shocking sights any Japanese admiral had ever witnessed in this war. But for now, on this quiet January morning in 1944, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara simply nodded to his chief of staff and said the same thing he said almost every morning. "Very well, carry on." And the lagoon remained perfectly still. Then came the morning of February 4th, 1944. 2 American Marine Corps, PB-4Y-1 Liberators, appeared high over the lagoon. They flew so high the Japanese lookouts could barely make them out against the bright sky. But the radio operators heard them. The anti-aircraft crews saw the glint of sunlight on aluminum wings. And within minutes, the message reached Dublon Island. Rear Admiral Hara was in the middle of his usual morning briefing when the telephone rang. He listened without expression as the duty officer read the report aloud. 2 enemy heavy bombers, altitude 30,000 feet, course 090, departing the area. Hara set the receiver down slowly. His chief of staff, Captain Kawamura, waited. Photo reconnaissance, Hara said quietly. They're taking pictures. They want to know exactly what we have here. Kawamura nodded. Both men understood what that meant. The Americans had never bothered with high-altitude photos of Truk before, not when they were still fighting their way up through the Solomons. Now they were coming. Later that same day, a longer, more detailed signal arrived from Admiral Mineichi Koga himself. Koga, commander-in-chief of the entire combined fleet, was hundreds of miles away at his temporary headquarters in Palau. His message was short, but it carried the weight of decision. Immediate withdrawal of major fleet units from Truk Lagoon, Musashi, the heavy cruisers, and all operational carriers to proceed west at best speed. 4th Fleet to remain and defend the anchorage with available forces. Hara read the order twice. He handed the paper to Kawamura without a word. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the wall clock. Sir, Kawamura said at last, if they are sending reconnaissance planes, they may be planning something larger than a raid. Hara walked to the large wall map and traced a line from the marshals toward Truk with his finger. His voice stayed calm, but there was a new edge in it. Intelligence section in Tokyo has been tracking their new carriers, Essex class. They say the Americans have launched 7 of them since the beginning of last year. Some reports even speak of 9. Kawamura picked up a fresh clipboard. He had been compiling the latest decrypts all morning. Latest estimate from Palau, Admiral. Task Force 58 under Mitcher now includes Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and at least 4 light carriers, possibly more on the way from Pearl Harbor. Hara stared at the map. He had seen the earlier reports, of course. Everyone had, but numbers on paper had a way of staying small until you spoke them out loud in the same room. 7 fleet carriers, he repeated slowly. In 1943 alone, the Americans laid down more Essex-class hulls than we have built heavy cruisers in the entire war. They are replacing ships faster than we can sink them. He turned away from the map and looked out the window again. The lagoon below still looked peaceful. The merchant ships that had not yet received sailing orders still rode at anchor. But something in the air had changed. Kawamura cleared his throat. Admiral Koga believes the main fleet units will be safer at Palau for now. He suggests we disperse the smaller vessels and prepare the airfields for maximum effort. Hara gave a short nod. He had spent 30 years in the Navy, learning that the best defense was often to strike first. But this time the enemy was not coming with a handful of carriers and a prayer. This time the enemy was coming with an entire new navy built in the time it took Japan to repair 1 battleship. For the first time in weeks, Hara allowed himself to voice the thought that had been growing in the back of his mind. They are not just building ships, Kawamura. They are manufacturing them. Like automobiles on an assembly line, one slips down the ways, and another is already half-finished behind it. He paused. The room felt smaller somehow. And now they have seen us. They know exactly where we are, and how many of us remain. Kawamura stood a little straighter. Shall I order the remaining tankers to begin dispersal, sir? Yes, Hara said, and double the air patrols. If the Americans are planning to come, they will not come with 2 bombers and a camera. They will come with everything they have. He looked once more at the calm blue water stretching to the horizon. Tell the staff we will hold a full conference at 1600 hours. I want every officer who can be spared. We must prepare for the possibility that Truk is no longer the safe harbor we once believed it to be. Outside, the tropical sun continued to beat down on the lagoon. The ships below rocked gently at their anchors, but for Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, the quiet January days were officially over. The first cracks had appeared in the armor of the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and the Americans were only 13 days away from turning those cracks into a flood. February 17th, 1944, 5:14 in the morning. The first warning came not from radar. Truk had none working that early, but from a single lookout posted on the eastern reef line. "Enemy aircraft approaching!" The shout cut through the tropical dawn like a knife. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara was in the operations room on Dublon Island, reviewing overnight signals when the telephone rang sharply. He picked it up himself. The voice on the other end was breathless. "Admiral, planes, dozens of them, no, hundreds, coming straight out of the rising sun." Hara didn't hesitate. He snatched his binoculars and strode out onto the concrete observation platform that overlooked the entire lagoon. Captain Kawamura and 3 senior staff officers hurried after him. At first, through the glasses, they saw only a few black specks against the pale pink sky. Small, distant, almost harmless. Hara lowered the binoculars for a second, then raised them again. "Count them," he ordered quietly. The officers began counting aloud. 10, 20, 50. The specks grew. They multiplied. They filled the horizon. 100, 200. By the time the first wave roared overhead, the count had passed 400. Hellcats. Hundreds of them. Wings gleaming in the early light. Engines screaming as they dove toward the airfields on Dublon and Eton. Hara's mouth tightened. He had never seen anything like it. Not in China, not in the early days of the war, not even in his worst nightmares. "More behind them," Kawamura said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, there are more waves coming." They kept counting. 500, 600. The sky above Truk Lagoon simply disappeared under American wings, wave after wave. Fighter sweeps so thick they cast moving shadows across the water. And then Hara saw what lay beyond the plains. On the horizon, faint at first, but growing clearer with every passing minute, sat the American fleet itself. Flat gray silhouettes, dozens of them, carriers, escort carriers, battleships, cruisers. The entire horizon was steel. "Count the carriers," Hara said, his voice flat. Kawamura's hands were shaking as he adjusted his own binoculars. 9, sir. At least 9 fleet carriers, maybe more behind the smoke." Hara said nothing for a long moment. The only sound was the thunder of American engines and the distant chatter of anti-aircraft guns finally opening up. Too late, too few. He had studied every intelligence summary. He knew the Americans had new ships. But knowing it, and seeing 9 carriers appear at once, all at the same time, all launching aircraft in perfect coordination, was something the mind refused to accept. One of the younger staff officers lowered his binoculars and simply stared. "Admiral, the sky is gone." Hara nodded once. The lagoon below, the same lagoon that had seemed so vast and safe only days earlier, was now nothing but a target range. Japanese fighters that managed to get airborne were swatted down almost instantly. Zeros trying to climb were met by Hellcats already at altitude, already turning inside them, already firing. Hara watched one Japanese plane spiral into the water less than a mile from shore. Then another. Then 3 more in quick succession. "Sir," Kawamura said, forcing himself to stay professional, "our air strength on the islands is less than 100 serviceable aircraft now." Hara didn't answer. He was still counting. Not the Japanese planes. He was counting the American ones. They kept coming. Fresh squadrons, fresh waves, as if the Americans had an endless supply of both planes and pilots. For the first time in his long career, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Helpless awe. Not fear, not panic. Just the cold, clear realization that what he was watching was not a raid. It was the future of naval warfare arriving all at once, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had brought a knife to a factory. He lowered his binoculars slowly. The platform around him had gone silent. Every officer was staring at the same impossible scene. Hara spoke only 2 words. Record everything. Then he turned and walked back inside without another glance. Behind him, the American planes continued their deadly ballet over Truk Lagoon. The sea itself had vanished beneath American steel and American wings, and the Gibraltar of the Pacific was already burning. By 6:30 that morning, the first fighter sweeps had done their work. The Japanese airfields on Dublon and Eton were already smoking ruins. Zeros that had managed to scramble were burning on the runways or floating in pieces on the lagoon. Rear Admiral Hara remained on the observation platform, binoculars pressed to his eyes. What followed next was something no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever seen on this scale. The dive bombers came in. Wave after wave of SBD Dauntlesses peeled off from high altitude, sirens screaming as they plunged straight down toward the anchored ships. Behind them flew the Avengers, heavy with torpedoes and 500-pound bombs. "Target the tankers first," Hara shouted to his signal officer. But the order was pointless. The Americans had already chosen their targets. The first ship to die was the Ikoku Maru, a fast transport converted to carry ammunition. Two Dauntlesses hit her almost simultaneously amidships. The explosion that followed was so violent it lifted the entire 200-foot hull clear of the water for a split second. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a burning crater in the sea and debris raining down for half a mile. The blast wave rattled windows on Dublon Island itself. Hara lowered his binoculars for a moment and simply stared. One ship, one heartbeat, gone. Then the tankers began to go. The Shinkoku Maru took 3 hits in the engine room and forward holds. Thick black oil poured into the lagoon and caught fire, turning the calm blue water into a sheet of flame. The Fujisan Maru followed seconds later, her cargo of aviation gasoline erupting in a tower of orange fire that climbed hundreds of feet into the sky. The heat was so intense Hara could feel it on his face even from the ridge above the harbor. "Order all remaining ships to get underway," he told Kawamura. "Any direction, just move." But the lagoon was a trap. Ships trying to raise anchor were met by coordinated attacks. One merchantman got her bow pointed toward the reef channel only to be bracketed by 4 Avengers in perfect formation. Torpedoes slammed home. She rolled over and sank in less than 2 minutes, her crew leaping into water already on fire. Hara watched it all with the detached precision of a man who refused to look away. He had commanded men in battle before. He had seen ships die. But never like this. Never with this terrible mechanical rhythm. The Americans did not rush. They did not waste ammunition. They came in groups of 6 or 8, dropped their loads with clinical accuracy, and climbed away to let the next group take their turn. It was as if they were reading from a checklist. By 9 o'clock, the repair ship Akashi was burning from stem to stern. Her workshops, full of spare parts the Japanese Navy desperately needed, lit up the sky like a second sun. Nearby, 3 more cargo vessels disappeared beneath the surface in quick succession, their masts the last things to vanish under the spreading oil fires. Kawamura's voice cracked as he read the latest damage reports. "Admiral, we have lost 11 merchantmen and auxiliaries confirmed sunk. Another 8 heavily damaged and on fire. The oil storage tanks on the eastern shore are also burning." Hara did not reply immediately. He was watching a single American dive bomber pull out of its run after putting a 500-pounder straight down the smokestack of a destroyer escort. The little ship simply disintegrated. "They are not even bothering with our anti-aircraft guns," Hara said quietly. "Look at them. They fly straight and level on their final approach. They know our gunners cannot touch them." It was true. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was frantic but wildly inaccurate. Tracers floated upward in slow, harmless arcs, while the American planes danced through them untouched. Around 10:30, the pattern changed again. The Americans began working methodically along the western side of the lagoon. They hit the floating dry dock, the water barges, even the small harbor tugs. Nothing was too small. Nothing was spared. One of the younger staff officers beside Hara finally spoke, the thought everyone was thinking. "Sir, it is as if they brought their entire Pacific supply of bombs just for us." Hara gave the smallest nod. He had stopped counting the American planes hours ago. They never seemed to run low on fuel. They never seemed to run low on ordnance. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, as though the carriers on the horizon were infinite. By early afternoon, the lagoon had become a single mass of flame and black smoke. The once clear water was now a thick soup of burning oil, floating wreckage, and the bodies of sailors. The air stank of gasoline and cordite. Hara finally lowered his binoculars. His uniform was damp with sweat, but his voice remained steady. "Send a signal to Admiral Koga at Palau. Tell him Truk is under sustained carrier air attack. Tell him we are holding, for now." He paused, then added softly, almost to himself, "And tell him the Americans fight with factories, not just with ships." The sun climbed higher, turning the smoke into a choking gray curtain over the entire anchorage. By late afternoon, the first day of the attack was not over. It was only pausing to reload. But Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara already understood something the rest of the Imperial Japanese Navy would not fully accept for months. This was not a battle. This was industrial annihilation delivered from the sky. And the lagoon, that had once been the pride of the South Pacific, was now a graveyard of steel and fire. February 18th, 1944. Dawn. The smoke from the previous day still hung thick over Truk Lagoon like a funeral shroud. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara had not slept. He stood once more on the observation platform, eyes burning from cordite and exhaustion, watching the surviving ships of his command make their desperate attempt to escape. They had received the order at midnight. Every vessel still capable of moving was to slip out under cover of darkness and run for the open sea. Palau. Anywhere but here. Hara watched them go. A ragged column of destroyers, patrol boats, and a few remaining light cruisers nosed their way toward the reef passages. Their decks were crowded with extra crew and wounded. No flags flew high. No proud signals passed between them. Just silent, determined movement. For a few precious minutes it looked as though some might make it. Then the horizon to the north lit up with muzzle flashes. American battleships. Hara raised his binoculars with hands that no longer trembled. There they were, two massive silhouettes against the gray morning sky, Iowa and New Jersey, the newest, most powerful battleships in the United States Navy, 16-inch guns trained and firing with mechanical precision. The first salvo straddled the light cruiser Katori like a steel hammer. Her thin hull shook as shells the size of small cars exploded along her waterline. Within seconds, she was listing heavily, smoke pouring from every hatch. Her captain tried to turn her toward the reef for grounding, but another salvo caught her amidships, and she simply broke in two. Hara lowered the glasses for a second, then forced himself to look again. Behind the battleships came American cruisers and destroyers. They moved in perfect formation, as though on parade. Their guns never stopped. Shell after shell walked across the water, chasing the fleeing Japanese ships like hunters tracking wounded animals. The destroyer Maikaze tried to fight back. She turned sharply and launched a spread of torpedoes toward the American line. The torpedoes ran true for a moment. Then the American destroyers simply opened fire with their 5-inch guns and cut Maikaze to pieces before her torpedoes could even reach their targets. She burned fiercely for less than 3 minutes before rolling over and disappearing. One by one the others followed. Patrol boats, submarine chasers, even a few armed merchantmen that had somehow survived the first day. They were picked off methodically. No panic firing from the Americans, no wild chases, just cold, calculated destruction at long range. "Submarines," Kawamura reported beside him, voice hoarse. "Multiple contacts outside the lagoon. They are waiting for anything that slips past the surface ships." Hara nodded. Of course there were submarines. The Americans had thought of everything. Air power above, battleships on the horizon, submarines beneath the waves, a 3-layered net with no holes. He watched a small group of Japanese destroyers try to zigzag their way north. For a brief moment they disappeared into a rain squall. Hope flickered in Hara's chest. Then the squall passed, and the American guns found them again. Shell splashes walked down the line until every ship in the group was either burning or sinking. By mid-morning, there was nowhere left to run. The sea around Truk Lagoon had become a killing field. Every escape route was covered. Every direction led to American steel. Hara spoke without taking his eyes from the horizon. "Signal Admiral Koga again. Tell him the surface ships that left during the night have been engaged and largely destroyed by enemy battleships and cruisers. Tell him we no longer control the waters around Truk." He paused, then added the words he had never imagined saying in his entire career. "Advise that continued resistance here serves no further strategic purpose." Kawamura looked at him sharply, but Hara's face remained calm. He was not defeated, he was simply stating fact. The Imperial Japanese Navy had come to Truk with the belief that coral reefs and courage could hold back an enemy. They had learned in 48 hours that factories and coordinated firepower could erase an entire fleet anchorage from existence. In the distance, another Japanese ship erupted in flame as an American shell found her magazine. The explosion was smaller this time. There were fewer ships left to explode. Hara finally lowered his binoculars. The platform was silent except for the distant thunder of American guns. "Record the positions of every sunken vessel," he said quietly. "Mark the wrecks. One day someone may want to know exactly where the Fourth Fleet died." He turned away from the sea. For the first time in 2 days, the observation platform felt empty. Behind him, the American battleships continued their methodical work, their guns flashing in the morning light. The lagoon that had once sheltered the pride of the South Pacific was now a corridor of death with no exit. And Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara understood with absolute clarity that the war had moved beyond courage. It had moved beyond strategy. It had become a question of production, and Japan was losing that battle by the hour. By late afternoon on the 18th, the guns finally fell silent. The American task force turned east and disappeared over the horizon as quickly as it had arrived. No farewell salvo, no victory signal, just the quiet departure of men who had completed their checklist and moved on to the next objective. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara stood alone on the observation platform for a long time after the last American plane vanished. The air still tasted of oil and smoke. Below him, the lagoon was no longer a harbor. It was a scrapyard. Captain Kawamura approached with the final compiled report. His hands were steady now. There was nothing left to shake for. "Total losses, Admiral," he began. 275 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. That includes every fighter, every bomber, and every reconnaissance plane based on the atoll. 42 merchant and auxiliary vessels sunk or beached and burning. More than 200,000 tons of shipping gone in 48 hours. All fuel reserves destroyed. All repair facilities unusable. Hara listened without interrupting. He had expected the numbers to be bad. He had not expected them to be absolute. "Truk is finished as a fleet base," Kawamura continued. "We can no longer refuel a destroyer here. We can no longer stage a single bomber squadron. The Gibraltar of the Pacific no longer exists." Hara took the report and folded it once. Then he walked back into the operations room and sat down at the radio table himself. He wrote the message slowly in his own hand. "To Admiral Koga, Combined Fleet. Truk Lagoon neutralized. Request immediate permission to evacuate all remaining personnel and equipment to safer ground. Further defense of this position serves no purpose." He handed the message to the radio officer. "Send it priority, and prepare a copy for Tokyo." The reply from Palau came faster than anyone expected. Koga's staff had been waiting. The message was brief and carried the quiet desperation of a commander who still believed in miracles. "Divert all available aircraft from Rabaul immediately. Re-establish air cover over Truk at all costs. Hold position until reinforcements arrive." Hara read the order twice. Then he handed it to Kawamura with a small, tired smile. "Rabaul," he said. "They want us to wait for planes from Rabaul." Both men knew the truth. Rabaul's air groups had been bled white for months. The few aircraft still flying there were worn out, short on pilots, and even shorter on fuel. Even if every plane left Rabaul tonight, most would never reach Truk. And those that did would find no place to land. Tokyo remained silent. No congratulatory message, no words of encouragement, no new orders, just silence. The same silence that had followed every major defeat since Midway. As if by not speaking the truth might somehow change. Hara walked to the window one last time. The sun was setting behind the smoke. The water below glowed red, not from sunset, but from the last burning oil slicks. Wrecked masts poked up like broken fingers. Lifeboats drifted aimlessly among the debris. A junior staff officer who had kept a private diary throughout the war wrote that night by the light of a single candle, "We have awakened a giant. Not just a fleet, but an entire nation that builds ships the way we once built swords. They do not fight with spirit alone. They fight with factories that never sleep. We can die bravely. We can die 1,000 times. But we cannot replace what they replace in a single month." Hara read the entry over the young man's shoulder, but said nothing. He simply placed a hand on the officer's shoulder for a moment, then walked away. Later that evening, he dictated one final signal. Not to Koga, not to Tokyo, to the surviving men scattered across the islands. "Destroy all classified documents. Prepare for evacuation. We have done all that honor requires. The rest is now in the hands of those who still believe this war can be won with courage alone." Truk Lagoon, once the most feared anchorage in the South Pacific, had been erased as a strategic asset in 2 days. Not by a superior fleet in a fair fight, not by brilliant tactics. It had been erased by sheer, overwhelming production. And for the first time in the long history of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a senior admiral understood that the war was no longer about who could fight hardest. It was about who could build fastest. And Japan had already lost that race. In the days that followed, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara found himself alone with thoughts he had never allowed himself to entertain in 30 years of service. He sat in the dim light of a makeshift shelter on Dublon Island, the distant sound of waves the only companion left to him. No more urgent signals, no more frantic briefings, just silence and memory. He had always believed that the Imperial Japanese Navy fought with something the Americans could never match, the spirit of the samurai. Unbreakable will, willingness to die for the emperor, careful use of every scarce resource, every drop of fuel, every round of ammunition, every pilot trained over years, not months. That was how Japan had won its early victories. That was how a smaller nation had held its own against giants. But Truk had shown him something else. The Americans did not fight with spirit alone. They fought with abundance. They fought as though the very factories of their homeland had been loaded onto their ships and sent across the ocean with them. Where Japan calculated every ton of steel, every barrel of oil, every hour of labor, the Americans simply produced more. They replaced losses before the smoke had even cleared. They built new carriers in the time it took Japan to repair an old destroyer. They trained new pilots while the old ones were still learning how to take off. Hara picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk. It was a summary his intelligence staff had prepared months earlier before the attack. Numbers that had once seemed abstract now burned in his mind like fire. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had launched more fleet carriers than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had possessed at the start of the war. Not improved versions of old designs, brand new Essex-class ships, each one larger, faster, and carrying more aircraft than anything Japan could build. And while Japan struggled with shortages of rubber, of aluminum, of trained welders, the Americans worked around the clock in factories untouched by war. No blackouts, no rationing that slowed production. Just endless shifts of men and women building the future of naval power as easily as they once built automobiles. He remembered the words of an American prisoner taken earlier in the war. The man had laughed when asked how his country planned to win. "We don't plan to win with courage," the prisoner had said. "We plan to win with factories that never sleep." At the time, Hara had dismissed it as enemy propaganda. Now he understood it was simply the truth. This was not a difference in bravery. Both sides had brave men. This was a difference in philosophy. Japan had entered the war thinking it would be decided by a single great battle, one decisive clash where samurai spirit would overcome material odds. The Americans had entered the war understanding that modern war is won by the nation that can keep fighting longest, the nation that treats war like an industrial process. Build, replace, improve, repeat. Hara stood slowly and walked to the edge of the shelter. The night sky was clear now, stars shining where smoke had once blocked them. He thought of the young officers he had trained, of the pilots who had once believed their Zero fighters were unbeatable, of the sailors who had sung as they sailed into battle. They had all believed the same thing he once believed, that will could conquer matter. Truk had taught them otherwise. The Americans had not come to fight a battle. They had come to demonstrate a new kind of war. A war where the loser was not the side that ran out of courage, but the side that ran out of ships, planes, and fuel first. And Japan, for all its courage, was running out of everything. In private conversations with his remaining staff, Hara began to speak words he never thought he would utter. "We knew they were rich," he told one trusted captain one quiet evening. "We knew they had factories and resources we could only dream of. But knowing it and seeing it are two different things. We asked for a fair fight against their fleet. They brought their entire industrial heartland with them." He paused, then added softly, "And that changes everything." This realization did not break Hara. It humbled him. It humbled every senior officer who had survived those 2 days. For the first time they understood that the war had moved beyond the old rules, beyond the old strategies of decisive battle, beyond the old belief that one great victory could end it all. The Americans were not trying to win one battle. They were trying to win the war of production, and in that war there was no room for samurai poetry or desperate charges. There was only the steady, relentless rhythm of American factories pouring out ships, planes, and ammunition faster than Japan could even count them. Hara folded the intelligence paper and placed it in his pocket. He would keep it as a reminder, not of defeat, but of the new reality. The Imperial Japanese Navy had always prided itself on fighting with the sword. The Americans had arrived with the factory, and in the long run, the factory always wins. That was the lesson of Truk. Not written in blood on the water, but written in steel across an ocean. A lesson every Japanese admiral who lived to see the end of the war would carry with him for the rest of his days. The last American ship disappeared over the horizon on the evening of February 18th. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara stood on the ridge above Dublon Island one final time. The smoke had thinned to a low haze. The lagoon lay quiet now, almost empty. He gave his last order of the day. "Evacuate all remaining personnel to the Western Islands. Destroy anything that cannot be carried." Then he walked down to the small dock where a battered patrol boat waited. No ceremony, no final salute, just the soft lap of water against the hull and the distant cry of seabirds returning to the reefs. In Tokyo, the news arrived in coded fragments. Admiral Koga read the reports in silence at his headquarters in Palau. He said nothing to his staff. He simply folded the papers and placed them in a drawer. Truk Lagoon, once the greatest forward base in the South Pacific, had been reduced to a scattering of wrecks in 48 hours. Today, more than 80 years later, those same wrecks still rest on the bottom. Divers glide past the broken hulls of the Aikoku Maru and the Fujisan Maru. Coral grows over twisted steel. Schools of fish move through empty engine rooms where Japanese sailors once stood at their posts. The water is calm again. The sky is empty. But for a few brief days in February 1944, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara and every Japanese officer who looked toward the horizon saw something no man in their navy had ever seen before. They saw the sky disappear under American wings. They saw the sea disappear under American hulls. They saw an entire fleet anchorage erased not by a superior enemy in a single battle, but by the simple, relentless arrival of ships and planes that kept coming long after any normal nation would have stopped. That was what the Japanese admirals saw when America's massive carrier fleet suddenly appeared over Truk Lagoon. And in that moment, they understood the war had already changed forever. The 19th of June, 1944, as the sun set over the Philippine Sea, witnessed the final hours of IJN Hyo, one of the aircraft carriers that had once been the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation force. Flames burned fiercely, the ship's hull tilted dangerously, and hundreds of sailors fought for the survival of their vessel. This was not merely the end of a warship, but a symbol of the collapse of Japanese carrier power in the Pacific. IJN Hyo had a special origin. Initially laid down as a luxury passenger liner named Izumo Maru, but when war broke out, the design was changed to convert her into an aircraft carrier. Launched in 1941 and commissioned in July 1942, Hyo measured 219 meters in length, had a standard displacement of 24,140 tons, and could carry approximately 53 combat aircraft. Unlike aircraft carriers designed from the outset for military purposes, such as Shokaku or Zuikaku, Hyo carried within her technical limitations from her civilian origins. The propulsion system was unstable, with a maximum speed of only 25 knots, lower than Japan's first-rate carriers. However, in the context of carrier scarcity following heavy losses at Midway, Hyo remained a valuable asset. During her 2 years of service, Hyo participated in many important campaigns. The ship was present at the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, supported operations in the Solomon Islands, and participated in defensive campaigns in the Central Pacific. Each time she launched aircraft, pilots from Hyo's deck fought bravely, but gradually the Japanese Naval Air Force was being worn down by irreplaceable losses. In June 1944, the Pacific War had entered a critical phase. American forces were attacking the Mariana Islands, an important chain of islands within Japan's inner defense perimeter. If the Marianas fell, American B-29 bombers could directly attack Japan's home islands. This was a red line that Tokyo could not afford to lose. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, activated Plan A-Go, a decisive campaign aimed at destroying the American carrier force. This mission was assigned to Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the 1st Mobile Fleet. Ozawa assembled a considerable force, 9 aircraft carriers carrying a total of 473 aircraft, along with 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. However, this number concealed a painful reality. The quality of Japanese pilots had declined severely. The experienced aces from Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea had mostly perished. In their place were young pilots hastily trained, with few training flight hours and lacking real combat experience. Many of them had only a few dozen flight hours before boarding carriers. Facing them was Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the most powerful force ever assembled in the Pacific. 15 aircraft carriers carrying nearly 1,000 aircraft, escorted by 7 new battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. American pilots were well trained, their aircraft more modern, especially the F-6F Hellcat, the Zero Killer. The American radar and air defense command system had developed to the point of being nearly impenetrable. Within Ozawa's formation, Hyo belonged to Carrier Fleet C, also known as Car Div 2, commanded by Admiral Takagi Joshima. Alongside Hyo were the carrier Junyo and the light carrier Ryuho. This was the weakest force among Ozawa's 3 carrier groups, deployed at the rear of the formation, about 100 nautical miles north of the main force. On the morning of the 19th of June, 1944, Hyo carried 27 aircraft, 0 fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo bombers. This number reflected the decline of Japanese naval aviation. Previously, Hiyo could carry over 50 aircraft. But Ozawa no longer had enough aircraft and pilots to fill his carrier decks. Ozawa's plan relied on one important advantage: range. Japanese aircraft could attack from greater distances than American planes. Ozawa hoped to attack the American fleet while remaining outside counterattack range. Moreover, Japanese aircraft, after attacking, could land at airfields on Guam and other Marianas Islands to refuel, then attack again when returning to carriers. Theoretically, this was a clever plan, but reality would prove it a deadly illusion. At dawn on the 19th of June, tension aboard Hiyo was thick enough to cut with a knife. The crew prepared aircraft, loaded ammunition, filled fuel tanks. Young pilots checked their equipment, many unable to hide their anxiety. They knew they were facing the most powerful enemy yet. At 0830, American radar detected the first attack wave from Ozawa's fleet. 69 Japanese aircraft were heading toward Task Force 58. This attack originated from carriers in fleets A and B, not from Hiyo. But their fate would foreshadow tragedy for the entire Japanese Naval Air Force that day. The American response was swift and deadly. The radar-based combat direction system allowed them to launch interceptors from long range. Dozens of F-6F Hellcats were launched, guided precisely to the Japanese aircraft positions. American pilots had trained in tactics to counter the Zero. They didn't enter old-style dogfights, but used the Hellcats' advantages in speed and durability. Dive down, fire, then accelerate away. The result was disaster. In the first attack wave, only 20 Japanese aircraft survived to return. The others fell into the sea in droves, shot down by Hellcats or destroyed by anti-aircraft fire from the American fleet. But Ozawa didn't recognize the scale of the disaster. Poor communications systems and false reports from surviving pilots led him to believe the attack had damaged the Americans. He ordered continued attacks. At 0900, a second attack wave with 130 aircraft was launched. This time, aircraft from Hiyo and other ships in Cardiff II participated. Young pilots from Hiyo's deck flew in formation, heading south where the American fleet waited. Once again, American radar detected them early. Once again, Hellcats were launched to intercept. In the air, inexperienced Japanese pilots faced veteran American warriors. Obsolete tactics, inferior aircraft, weaker skills, all converged into a predetermined outcome. American pilots later described that day's air battle as a turkey shoot. Japanese aircraft fell in waves. The cumbersome Jill torpedo bombers, moving slowly, were easy targets. The Judy bombers didn't even reach the American fleet. The Zero, once king of the skies, was now prey for the Hellcat. The second attack wave lost 98 of 130 aircraft. Survivors flew to Guam to land as planned, but there they were intercepted by Hellcats from carriers and land-based American aircraft. There was no safe haven. At midday on the 19th of June, Ozawa launched a third attack wave with 47 aircraft. Once again, they met the steel wall of Hellcats and anti-aircraft fire. Only a few returned. The fourth and final attack wave was launched in the late afternoon. 82 aircraft, primarily from Cardiff II, including Hiyo. But this time, due to poor coordination, many aircraft became lost. Some didn't even find the American fleet. Those that did were intercepted. Only half returned. When darkness fell on the 19th of June, Ozawa had lost approximately 350 aircraft in one day, nearly three-quarters of his air strength. Meanwhile, America lost only about 30 aircraft, mostly due to operational accidents. Not a single American warship was sunk or seriously damaged. Aboard Hiyo, the atmosphere was frighteningly silent. Many aircraft didn't return. Many pilots, friends, comrades were missing. The ship remained intact, not yet directly attacked, but her air strength had been severely depleted. The crew worked through the night repairing damaged aircraft, refueling, preparing for tomorrow. But in everyone's hearts, they knew they were losing. What Ozawa didn't yet know was that while his aircraft were being slaughtered in the air, two of his other Tigers had fallen beneath the waves. The carrier, Taiho, Japan's newest and largest carrier, was torpedoed by the submarine USS Albacore early in the morning. Initially, the damage seemed minor, but gasoline vapor accumulated, and in the evening, a massive explosion tore the ship apart. Taiho sank with 1,650 sailors. The carrier Shokaku, one of the veterans from Pearl Harbor, was also attacked by the submarine USS Kavala. 3 torpedoes hit their mark. Fire and explosions spread throughout the ship. A few hours later, Shokaku also sank, taking more than 1,200 men with her. Ozawa had lost 3 carriers and more than 2/3 of his aircraft in just one day. But he still hadn't withdrawn. He still believed he had damaged the Americans and victory could still be achieved. It was a fatal mistake. Dawn on the 20th of June, 1944, broke over the Philippine Sea with an eerie calm. Aboard Hiyo, the crew was exhausted after a night of non-stop work. The remaining aircraft had been prepared, but everyone knew their air strength had been devastated. Ozawa finally recognized the scale of the previous day's disaster and was considering withdrawing to the northwest, but he hadn't completely abandoned hope. Meanwhile, on the American side, Admiral Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, had not permitted Mitcher to pursue the Japanese fleet during the night. Spruance worried this might be a trap, and his priority was protecting the landing force at Saipan. This decision was controversial. Many believed that if permitted, Mitcher could have completely destroyed the Japanese fleet during the night. But on the morning of the 20th of June, scout planes from Task Force 58 were launched, sweeping for traces of Ozawa's fleet. For hours, they found nothing. Ozawa was farther to the northwest than predicted, and the American scout plane's operational range was nearing its limit. At 15:40 in the afternoon, an Avenger scout finally discovered the Japanese fleet. Coordinates were immediately sent back to TF-58. Mitcher faced a difficult decision. The Japanese fleet was 275 nautical miles away, near the operational limit of American aircraft. If they attacked now, aircraft would have to return in darkness with fuel running low. Many pilots would have to land at night, an extremely dangerous operation even under ideal conditions. Casualty rates from accidents could be very high, but this was the only chance to destroy the Japanese fleet. If they missed it, Ozawa would escape into darkness, and they might never find him again. Mitcher made the decision: attack! At 16:21, 216 aircraft from TF-58 carriers were launched, 95 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 54 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and 51 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, along with some aircraft from smaller squadrons. They flew northwest, chasing the setting sun, knowing they would have to return in darkness. Aboard Hiyo, air raid warnings sounded at approximately 17:30. Ships in Ozawa's fleet immediately increased speed, changed course, created smoke screens to disrupt targeting. Air defense systems were placed on highest alert, but after the previous day's losses, Ozawa no longer had enough fighters to form an effective air defense screen. Only a few dozen Zeros could take off, and they were quickly overwhelmed by escorting Hellcats. Around 17:20 to 17:40 in the evening, American aircraft arrived over the Japanese fleet. The sun was setting, staining the sky orange-red. It was a beautiful but deadly scene. The Helldivers began diving at steep angles, targeting the carriers. Anti-aircraft guns roared like a storm. Black clouds of flak filled the sky. Surrounding destroyers and cruisers concentrated fire, trying to create a steel wall. Hiyo was executing violent evasive maneuvers, turning the rudder left and right, trying to avoid falling bombs. Several bombs exploded near the ship's side, creating giant water columns. But up to this point, Hiyo had not yet taken a direct hit. After the Helldiver attack, it was the TBF Avengers' turn. These cumbersome aircraft carried the most lethal weapon against warships, the Mark 13 torpedo. They flew low, skimming the water surface, advancing toward the carriers. This was a suicide mission, flying straight into dense anti-aircraft fire, but the American pilots were well trained and determined. A TBF Avenger from the carrier USS Belleau Wood, piloted by Lieutenant George Brown, broke through the wall of fire and dropped his torpedo from close range. The torpedo streaked through the water, leaving a white wake, heading straight for Hio's starboard side. On the bridge, they saw the torpedo wake approaching. Orders to turn the rudder were given, but it was too late. With a mass of over 24,000 tons, Hio couldn't turn fast enough. The torpedo struck the starboard side near the middle of the hull in the worst possible location, right at the aviation fuel storage area and near the ammunition magazine. The terrible explosion shook the entire ship. An orange-red fireball erupted, blowing away thin armor plates, tearing open the hull. The shock waves spread throughout the decks, knocking down standing sailors. But that was only the beginning of the tragedy. Aviation fuel began to burn. Flames spread with horrifying speed, fed by gasoline and lubricating oil. Thick black smoke began rising from inside the ship. Temperature soared, turning the below-deck compartments into hell. The electrical system was heavily damaged. Lights went out in many areas. Fire pumps lost power. Internal communications were interrupted. In darkness and smoke, the crew tried to orient themselves, seeking ways to fight the spreading flames. The ship's speed decreased sharply. The propulsion system was affected by the explosion and fire. From 25 knots, Hio gradually slowed to 15, then 10 knots. The ship began losing maneuverability, becoming an easier target. On deck, firefighting teams sprang into action. They pulled hoses, trying to spray water on the fire. But without electricity, water pressure was weak. Some brave men carrying handheld fire extinguishers rushed down to below-deck compartments, trying to reach the fire's epicenter. Temperature and toxic smoke made this nearly impossible. Meanwhile, American aircraft continued attacking the fleet. Other ships were also hit. The carriers Zuikaku, Chiyoda, and Ryuho all took bomb hits, but damage wasn't severe. Other warships were also attacked. But Hio was that day's worst casualty. By approximately 1800 hours, it was clear the situation aboard Hio was dire. The fire wasn't being controlled, but was spreading further. Firefighting teams had tried their utmost, but it wasn't enough. The flames were now creeping toward the main ammunition magazine. If fire reached there, the entire ship would be torn apart. Admiral Joshima, commanding Cardiv II, was aboard the nearby Yunyo, watching Hio burning. He ordered destroyers to move closer to prepare for rescue. But with battle still ongoing, this was extremely dangerous. On Hio's bridge, Captain Toshiyuki Yokoi, the ship's commanding officer, faced the most difficult decision of his career. The ship was listing more and more toward the torpedoed side. Seawater was flooding in through the large hole. Pumping efforts couldn't keep pace. The ship was slowly capsizing. Around 1900 hours, fire had reached near the ammunition magazine area. Extreme heat was causing metal bulkheads to glow red. Ammunition in the magazine began sensing the heat. These were the final moments. Yokoi gave the order. All crew, abandon ship. The order was passed throughout the ship, from mouth to mouth in compartments without electricity. The crew began moving to the deck. Many helped wounded comrades. In smoke and darkness, they found their way out. Life jackets were distributed. Life rafts were lowered into the water. The crew began jumping into the sea. The night water was ice cold, but still better than the burning hell aboard ship. The destroyers Akishimo, Shigure, Michishio, Hamakaze, Samidare, and Hayashimo risked moving close, lowering boats to pick up survivors. This was dangerous work. At any moment, Hio could explode, and the destroyers could be caught up in it. 1932 hours. About 2 hours after being hit by the torpedo, the inevitable occurred. Fire reached the main ammunition magazine, or accumulated gasoline vapor caused a massive internal explosion. The terrible explosion tore out Hio's heart. A giant fireball rose hundreds of meters high, illuminating the entire sea. The shockwave could be felt from ships kilometers away. Metal fragments flew everywhere. The entire midsection of the ship seemed lifted above the water, then collapsed. After the massive explosion, Hiyo broke in two, or was damaged so severely she lost all structural integrity. Bow and stern sections began flooding rapidly. The ship rolled to one side. The wide flight deck that had once been the landing place for dozens of aircraft now tilted at a grotesque angle. Those still aboard the ship, those trapped, too severely wounded to move, or those who had chosen to remain until the end, now had no chance of survival. Seawater rushed in with terrifying force, filling compartments, corridors, dragging the ship downward. Within a few minutes after the massive explosion, Hiyo disappeared beneath the surface. The flight deck slid down for the last time, creating a large whirlpool, pulling debris and final smoke columns with it. Then nothing remained but ocean waves and survivors swimming in darkness. IJN Hiyo had sunk to the bottom of the Philippine Sea at approximately 15 degrees 30 minutes north, 135 degrees 15 minutes east, along with 247 crew members, 35 officers and 212 sailors. Approximately 1,400 people were rescued by Japanese destroyers that night and the following morning. Captain Yokoi, although wounded and intending to go down with his ship, was swept away by the water and rescued by the destroyer Mishishio. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended with a complete defeat for Japan. Besides Hiyo, they also lost Taiho and Shokaku. Two oilers, Hayasui and Genyo Maru, were sunk. More importantly, they had lost over 600 aircraft and approximately 445 pilots and aircrew, a loss the Japanese Naval Air Force could never recover from. Ozawa withdrew with his crippled fleet to Okinawa. His remaining carriers had virtually no aircraft. The Japanese Navy would never again be able to organize a large-scale carrier campaign. For America, this was an overwhelming victory. They lost only 130 aircraft, mostly due to running out of fuel or accidents during night landings on the 20th of June. 49 pilots and aircrew perished, but many were rescued. No warships were sunk. The Marianas fell in the following weeks. From airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, B-29 bombers began strategic bombing campaigns against Japanese cities. The path to the war's end had been opened. Hiyo, a ship born from a civilian design, had served the Japanese fleet for 2 turbulent years. She was not the strongest or most famous carrier, but she had fought in every major battle after Midway. Her pilots and crew had fulfilled their duty until the final moment. Today, Hiyo's wreck still lies silent on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, more than 3,000 meters below the surface. A quiet memorial to those who sacrificed on her decks, and a symbol of an era that had closed when Japanese carrier power, which had once shaken the Pacific, was finally extinguished in fire and seawater. June 19, 1944, in the midst of the vast blue waters of the Philippine Sea, one of the world's most modern warships was preparing for its defining battle. This was IJN Taiho, the Great Phoenix, the pride and final hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Only 3 months after joining the fleet, Taiho would experience one of the most tragic naval disasters of World War II. This is the story of the final day of Japan's super aircraft carrier. IJN Taiho represented the pinnacle of Japanese shipbuilding technology. At 260 meters in length and displacing 29,300 tons, Taiho was Japan's first armored deck fleet carrier, a feature that even American carriers of the time did not possess. The 75 to 80 millimeter thick armor protected the flight deck, designed to withstand 500-kilogram bombs. A multi-layered defense system with 15 watertight compartments, double-hulled construction, and the most advanced firefighting systems. Taiho could carry 75 aircraft, including Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo bombers. Every detail was meticulously calculated. Japanese engineers believed they had created an unsinkable ship. In March 1944, when Taiho was completed, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the mobile fleet, chose Taiho as his flagship. This was the highest honor, the command center for the entire Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. In June 1944, American forces landed on Saipan, an island within Japan's inner defensive perimeter. If Saipan fell, American B-29 bombers could directly attack Tokyo. The Japanese Navy had no choice. They had to fight a decisive battle. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet assembled 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, a total of 473 aircraft. Opposing them was the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 under Admiral Raymond Spruance. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. They had 956 aircraft, double the Japanese numbers. On Taiho's deck, the atmosphere was tense to the extreme. Over 2,150 sailors prepared for the greatest battle of their lives. Pilots conducted final checks. Technicians fueled the aircraft. At 8:30 a.m. on June 19th, the first attack wave was launched. The roar of aircraft engines shook the air. 69 planes from Taiho soared into the sky, heading toward the American fleet 300 nautical miles away. But just beneath the surface, danger was lurking. USS Albacore, SS-218, was a U.S. Navy Gato-class submarine under the command of Lieutenant Commander James W. Blanchard. Since 5 a.m., Albacore had been submerged at periscope depth, patrolling these waters. At 8:09 a.m., the periscope watch shouted, "Carrier, dead ahead, 10 o'clock." Blanchard looked through the scope. His heart raced. It was a massive carrier, unlike any he had ever seen. The deck was flat, without the high island structure typical of other carriers. Around it were dozens of escorts. This was IJN Taiho. Albacore silently moved into firing position. At 9:09 a.m., Blanchard gave the order, "Fire!" 6 Mark 14 torpedoes launched from the forward tubes, leaving trails of bubbles on the surface. Each torpedo carried 300 kilograms of Torpex explosive, heading straight toward the massive carrier. On Taiho, lookouts spotted the torpedo tracks. Alarm bells rang throughout the ship. But at nearly 30,000 tons, Taiho couldn't maneuver quickly enough. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu had just taken off minutes earlier. Over the radio, he heard warnings about the torpedoes. Looking down, he saw the white wakes racing toward his mothership. In an instant, Komatsu made his decision. He pushed the stick forward, diving, his Zero straight into one of the torpedoes. A tremendous explosion. The Zero and the torpedo disintegrated into thousands of pieces. Komatsu died instantly. His sacrifice deflected 3 other torpedoes. 2 torpedoes passed by the bow, but the 6th torpedo kept coming. At 9:14 a.m., the torpedo struck Taiho's starboard side, just below the flight deck, near the forward aircraft elevator. A deafening crash echoed through the hull. The explosion shook the entire ship. Sailors were thrown sideways. Lights flickered. The ship listed slightly to starboard. But Taiho was designed to withstand such hits. The damage control system automatically activated. Watertight doors closed. Pumps ran at full capacity. The initial damage seemed controllable. The forward elevator was damaged. Some compartments flooded. Aviation fuel lines ruptured. The ship could still make 26 knots. Anti-aircraft systems still functioned. Aircraft could still take off and land. Captain Kikuchi ordered continued combat operations. On the bridge, Admiral Ozawa decided not to leave the ship. Taiho remained the flagship. Everyone believed their supercarrier had survived the crisis. They were wrong. The real disaster was just beginning. The torpedo had ruptured the aviation fuel lines, the high-grade gasoline used for aircraft. Fuel began leaking into compartments below deck. Aviation fuel was one of the most dangerous liquids on an aircraft carrier. It was extremely volatile. Gasoline vapor was heavier than air, accumulated in low areas, and required only a small spark to cause a catastrophic explosion. Gradually, the smell of gasoline began to spread. Sailors reported the strong odor of fuel in many areas of the ship. The problem was, the chief engineer responsible for damage control had been killed in the torpedo explosion. His replacement, a young, inexperienced officer, faced a situation for which he had never been trained. The replacement officer thought, If we open, the entire ventilation system, the wind will blow away the gasoline smell. The ship will be ventilated. The problem will be solved. At 10 a.m., the order was given. Open all ventilation ports. Turn on ventilation fans. Open windows and hatches. Immediately, the worst thing happened. Instead of blowing the gasoline vapor out, the ventilation system did something else. It dispersed the gasoline vapor to every corner of the ship. The aviation fuel vapor mixed with air created a perfect explosive mixture. With each passing minute, the entire ship became a giant bomb. Thousands of cubic meters of explosive mixture accumulated in the engine rooms, ammunition storage, corridors, and crew quarters. Taiho continued combat operations as normal. No one realized they were sitting on a powder keg about to explode. From 10 a.m. until 2:30 p.m., Taiho remained operational. Aircraft took off. Aircraft landed. Admiral Ozawa commanded the battle from the bridge. Outside, the Battle of the Philippine Sea raged intensely. American pilots shot down Japanese planes like shooting turkeys. In 4 attack waves, Japan lost over 300 aircraft while sinking only 2 American ships. But the greatest tragedy had not yet arrived. No one knows exactly where the ignition source came from. Perhaps a spark from a generator, perhaps a cigarette, perhaps metal friction. Just one tiny spark was needed. At 2:32 p.m., hell descended. A thunderous blast ripped through the air. A tremendous explosion tore IJN Taiho apart from the inside out. The armored flight deck, the 75mm armor designed to withstand 500-kilogram bombs, was blown into the air like cardboard. Massive steel plates flew dozens of meters high before crashing into the sea. The aircraft elevator, weighing dozens of tons, was launched into the sky like a toy. A column of black smoke rolled hundreds of meters high, visible from dozens of miles away. The ship shook so violently, people thought it had been torpedoed. But this wasn't an attack from outside. This was the ship destroying itself from within. In the engine rooms, hundreds of sailors died instantly. The explosion pressure crushed their bodies. Those near the center of the blast didn't even know what happened. Fire spread at terrifying speed. Temperatures reached thousands of degrees. Steel melted. Tar on the deck bubbled and boiled. The electrical system collapsed. The entire ship plunged into darkness. Only the light from flames remained, the light of destruction. Toxic smoke filled the corridors. Sailors struggled to find escape routes in the darkness, coughing, eyes burning. Many became lost in the maze of the massive ship. They ran to doors that had been jammed shut by the explosion. They cried for help, but no one could hear them over the roar of the flames. Firefighting teams tried to extinguish the flames, but the water system had no pressure. Pumps had stopped working. They could only stand and watch the fire consume the ship. At 3 p.m., Taiho began listing heavily to starboard. Seawater poured in through massive cracks in the hull. The watertight compartment system, once Taiho's pride, was completely helpless against the scale of damage. On the bridge, Admiral Ozawa tried to remain calm, but he knew Taiho could not be saved. At 3:20 p.m., when the ship listed 20 degrees and was clearly sinking, he was forced to leave. Destroyer Wakatsuki approached through the fire and smoke to pick up Ozawa and his staff. At 3:28 p.m., Captain Kikuchi gave the order. "Abandon ship! All hands to the flight deck! Jump into the sea!" Hundreds of men rushed to the deck in panic. Some wore life vests, some did not. They jumped into the sea from 20 meters high. Some died upon hitting the water. Some were pulled into the still-turning propellers. The escort ships tried to approach to rescue survivors, but Taiho was sinking fast and could drag the smaller vessels down. At 3:32 p.m., just 6 hours after being torpedoed, IJN Taiho capsized completely. The massive ship, 260 meters long, 29,300 tons, slowly rolled over. The bow shot high into the air. The massive propellers emerged from the water, still rotating slowly. Those still on the ship fell into the water like dolls. Cries for help rang out everywhere. Then, with the terrifying sound of twisting and breaking metal, Taiho slid into the depths. A massive whirlpool sucked in debris and those unfortunate enough to be nearby. Air bubbles erupted to the surface. A large oil slick spread out, burning fiercely. Then came silence. The supercarrier Taiho, symbol of Japan's hope, had vanished to the bottom of the Philippine Sea at a depth of 3,000 meters. Of approximately 2,150 sailors and airmen aboard Taiho, 1,650 perished. Only 500 survived. Admiral Ozawa and his staff were lucky to escape death. At sea, destroyers rescued the survivors. Many were severely burned, some were in shock. All were exhausted and traumatized. No one found the body of Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, the pilot who crashed his plane into the torpedo to save Taiho. He sacrificed himself to buy 6 more hours for the ship. But those 6 hours were not enough. Taiho still sank. Just hours later, the carrier Shokaku was also sunk by an American submarine. In one day, Japan lost its 2 largest carriers. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was a complete disaster. Japan lost over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. America lost only 123 aircraft and no carriers. On June 19, 1944, IJN Taiho, the Great Phoenix, sank to the ocean floor along with 1,650 sailors. With it sank the final hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The shortest-lived major carrier in history, only 3 months from completion, to sinking. The wreck lies at approximately 3,000 meters depth in the Philippine Sea, never to be found. This is the story of the final battle of IJN Taiho, a lesson written in fire and seawater, in steel and blood, at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, 3,000 meters deep. March 1945, Iwo Jima. The battle had lasted 36 days. 6,800 Americans were dead. More Marines died on that island than in any other engagement in the entire history of the United States Marine Corps. When the last shot was fired, American officers began accounting for everything. They wanted the body of the Japanese general who had commanded the defense, the man responsible for 36 days of hell on 8 square miles of volcanic rock. They never found him, not because he escaped. He had removed every rank insignia from his uniform before leading his last 300 men into the darkness. His remains lie somewhere on that island to this day. Nobody knows exactly where. General Holland Smith, who commanded the entire expeditionary force at Iwo Jima and had been fighting the Japanese since Guadalcanal, said after the war, "Of all our adversaries in the Pacific, Kuribayashi was the most redoubtable. Not the most dangerous at Iwo Jima, the most dangerous of the entire war. But this isn't a story about Iwo Jima. This is a story about what Americans found after the battle was over, and about the family of that man, in Tokyo, 7,000 miles from an island that wasn't even on their map, and how they survived after he didn't come home. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi. To the Americans in 1945, it was just another Japanese name that nobody could pronounce. Nobody in Washington knew who he was before the battle started. No significant intelligence file. No special warning from Pacific Command about the general they'd sent to Iwo Jima. That was the first American mistake. Kuribayashi was born in 1891 in Nagano, in the mountains of central Japan. His family were samurai, several generations back, at least. By the time he came along, that heritage didn't mean much. His father worked construction to keep the family fed. Kuribayashi grew up wanting to be a journalist. Instead, he joined the army. It was the most practical path available to a young man with no money and no connections in early 20th century Japan. He was a good student, exceptionally good in English. In 1928, the Japanese military sent him to Washington as an attaché. For 2 years, he traveled across the United States, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, New York. He visited the Ford plant. He watched steel mills running around the clock. He counted ships in harbor. He wrote everything down with the careful eye of an officer trained to measure an enemy's capacity for war. None of what he observed was secret, but the conclusion he drew was something nobody in Tokyo wanted to hear. He came back and said it plainly. If Japan went to war with the United States in a long campaign, Japan would lose, not might lose, would lose. He wasn't the only one saying it. Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and also served as an attaché in Washington, made the same warning to military leadership. Both men were ignored. What made Kuribayashi different from most Japanese officers who passed through Washington was that he didn't just observe America professionally. He appears to have genuinely liked the country. He had American friends. He went to horse races. He ate in the same diners and roadside lunch counters that ordinary Americans used. He wrote home about the openness of American people, how strangers would strike up conversations, how a man could walk into a room full of people he'd never met and leave with invitations for dinner. He understood that what made America powerful wasn't just the steel mills and the shipyards. It was the people inside them. And that understanding made the war, when it came, feel to him like something close to personal grief. But here is the detail that separates him from every other officer who passed through Washington. In the evenings, alone in his hotel room, he wrote letters home to his son. Taro was 3 years old and couldn't read yet. So Kuribayashi drew pictures. He drew the Manhattan skyline the way it looked from the street below. Skyscrapers he had walked past that afternoon. He drew automobiles parked along Michigan Avenue in Chicago. He drew American families eating dinner, children playing in front yards, factory workers on their lunch break. Every letter was a page of hand-drawn illustrations, a future general sending picture books home to a toddler who would someday inherit them without fully understanding what they meant. Those letters still exist. They were published after the war under the title Picture Letters from the Commander-in-Chief. Anyone can read them today. What they show is a man who wasn't studying America from the outside. He had walked those streets, eaten in those diners. He understood the country in a way that very few of his contemporaries ever would. And that understanding is what made what came next so unbearable for him to watch. 13 years later, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese pilots flew toward Pearl Harbor. Kuribayashi read the news. He said nothing to his wife. He didn't need to. Yoshi looked at his face and understood. June 1944, Tokyo. Kuribayashi received his orders. He was going to Iwo Jima. He knew it was a death sentence. Before he left the house, he said one thing to Yoshi. "This time I probably won't even be able to send my bones home." She didn't answer. She turned and walked to the kitchen. That morning she cooked red rice and salted herring. In Japan, red rice is a celebration dish. You make it for good news, for homecomings, for victory. She wasn't making it for any of those reasons. She made it because it was his favorite. It was all she could do. There were 3 children in the house. Taro, 19, already old enough to be drafted. Yoko, 15, and Takako, the youngest, 9 years old, the one he called Tako-chan in his letters. Before he walked out the door, Kuribayashi wrote Takako a short note. "Listen to your mother. Grow up fast and strong. That's all your father asks." No promise that he'd return. No, "I'll miss you." Just a father trying to tell a 9-year-old girl, without being able to say it directly, that he wasn't coming back, and that the only thing he wanted was for her to live well without him. He walked out the door. He didn't look back. That was the detail Takako carried with her until the end of her life. That her father walked out that door and never once turned around. Not because he was cold, because he knew if he turned around, he wouldn't be able to leave. A family of 5. Red rice and salted herring. One short note to a 9-year-old girl. That was all that was left of that morning. The Marines landed on Iwo Jima on February 19th, 1945. For the first 5 minutes, nothing happened. The Navy had bombarded the island continuously for 3 days before the landing. By every calculation, Nothing could have survived. But when the first wave hit the beach, the island was completely silent. The men looked at each other. Nobody understood what was going on. Then hell opened up. Kuribayashi had built 18 miles of tunnels beneath the island, cut 30 feet into the rock, connected into a network that naval guns and aerial bombing couldn't reach. He had forbidden every Japanese soldier on the island from conducting banzai charges, the mass suicide attacks the Japanese used everywhere else in the Pacific. He considered them a waste. He wanted every man to fight from underground 1 inch at a time until the very last soldier was gone. Marines who had been at Tarawa knew what a banzai charge looked like. Marines who had been at Saipan knew what a Japanese defensive line looked like. Nobody knew how to deal with an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't draw out, couldn't find. One that fired from ventilation holes the size of a fist and then disappeared back into the earth. On day 1, they advanced a few hundred yards. On day 2, less than that. On day 5, the day the whole island was supposed to be secured, they were still dying in the tunnels 1 inch at a time. On February 23rd, 4 days after the landing, 6 Marines climbed to the top of Mount Suribachi and raised the flag. Joe Rosenthal was there with a camera. The photograph he took that afternoon became the most famous image of the entire Pacific War. Pulitzer Prize, cast in bronze in Washington, on the cover of every magazine in America. But when that flag went up on Suribachi, Kuribayashi was still alive, still commanding from underground on the northern end of the island. 20 more days of fighting ahead of him. And he knew it. 36 days, each one the same. On March 26th, Kuribayashi led the roughly 300 men still standing, all that remained of 21,000 defenders, in one final night attack. Before he left the command post, he stripped every rank insignia from his uniform. Nobody knows why. In the days after the guns went quiet, American troops began clearing the tunnel network on the island's northern end, where Kuribayashi had established his final headquarters. That's where they found Master Sergeant Taizo Sakai. Sakai had handled coded communications for Kuribayashi, and was one of the very few people from the command staff still breathing. He was hiding among ammunition crates, not in uniform, holding a surrender leaflet in both hands. Captain Fiorenzo Lepardo took him in. Lepardo had studied languages at Notre Dame. He tried German, tried Italian, tried Spanish. Sakai shook his head each time. Then Sakai looked at him and asked, "Parlez-vous français?" They sat down in a shell crater and talked in French. Sakai told Lepardo about Kuribayashi, about the months on the island, about the final night, and about the letters. Dozens of handwritten letters found in the tunnels. Not military documents, not operational orders, personal letters. Some of them had hand-drawn illustrations. Buildings, automobiles, city streets. A soldier from Ohio looked at those drawings and recognized them immediately. That was New York. That was Chicago. Sakai explained. Kuribayashi had walked those streets, sat in those restaurants. And in the evenings, in hotel rooms in American cities, he had drawn pictures of what he saw to send home to a son who was too young to read. Before Sakai was transferred up the chain of command to be debriefed further by regimental Japanese language officers Richard White and John McLean, he reached into his shirt and handed Lepardo 2 photographs, one of himself with his wife, one with his young daughter. "I know they will take these from me," Sakai said in French. "I want you to keep them." Then he said, "I am already dead. I can never go home." Lepardo kept those photographs for the rest of his life. After the war, he went to Harvard Law School and became a Superior Court judge in California. But he never stopped thinking about the man in the shell crater. He died in 2004, still searching for Sakai's family, still trying to return the photographs. That same year in Tokyo, Takako, the 9-year-old who had watched her father walk out the door without looking back, also died. They never knew each other. But in 2004, both of them were gone, each carrying the memory of the same man, Word of Kuribayashi's death reached Tokyo in the spring of 1945. There was no state funeral, no government delegation at the door. Japan in 1945 was collapsing too fast to account for every soldier's family. Most of Tokyo had already been burned to the ground by LeMay's B-29s in March. Food was scarce. People lined up before dawn for whatever was left. And Yoshi, the widow of the general who had just died on Iwo Jima, stood in those lines like everyone else. She was 41 years old, a widow, 3 children, and she had never worked a day in her life. That wasn't laziness. That was the reality for officers' wives in Japan at the time. A general's wife did not take outside work. Her husband served, she managed the household. That was the arrangement. There were no exceptions. Then her husband didn't come back, and that arrangement didn't feed 3 children. Yoshi went out and sold dried squid in the street. That's not a metaphor. She stood in the market and sold dried squid to buy rice. That's what her daughter described decades later, in plain language with no particular emotion. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American soldiers appeared on the streets of Tokyo within weeks. Jeeps rolled through neighborhoods that the B-29s hadn't reached. American servicemen bought goods at the markets, ate at the stalls, stood around taking photographs of the ruins. Yoshi, the widow of the man who had spent 36 days trying to kill those same men, lived in the same city with them, stood in the same market lines. She left no record of what that felt like. The American occupation of Japan lasted until 1952. 7 years. General Douglas MacArthur ran the country from an office building in central Tokyo. American policy dismantled Japan's military, rewrote its constitution, restructured its economy. For the families of Japanese officers, men who had fought and died for a government that no longer existed, those years were not easy to navigate. There was no framework for what they were supposed to feel. Their country had told them their husbands and fathers had died for something sacred. The Americans arrived and told Japan that everything it had believed was wrong. Yoshi didn't have time to process any of that. She had 3 children to feed. She just kept doing what needed to be done, and she put all 3 of her children through college. In Japan in the 1950s, that was not a given, especially for a daughter. Most families of that era only sent their sons to university. Girls finished high school and got married. Yoshi didn't see it that way. Tako-chan went to university the same as her brother. Yoshi lived to be 98 years old. She died in 2003. Nearly 60 years as a widow. No grave to visit, no island close enough to reach. But before she died, she went. She flew to Iwo Jima and stood on the black volcanic ground where her husband had died 6 decades earlier. No headstone, no marker with his name, just the island and the Pacific Ocean and the wind. She didn't leave any account of what she said or thought or felt standing there. In 2003, a Japanese writer named Kumiko Kakehashi began researching Kuribayashi. She wanted to write about the real man behind the battle. Not the general, not the tactics, but the person who had written letters home from that island. She tracked down the family. She read through hundreds of letters, and she sat with Takako, now nearly 70 years old, and read aloud what Takako's father had written in his final months on Iwo Jima. In a letter to Takako from September 1944, Kuribayashi had written, "Mind your mother. Grow up quickly. That's what makes your father happy. I think of you always." When Kakehashi finished reading, she looked at Takako and said, "He was thinking of you right up until the end." Takako didn't cry. She sat still for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, and because of him, I've had a very happy life." That was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just one sentence from a woman approaching 70, looking back across a lifetime of growing up without a father and finding something there that wasn't loss. Takako died in 2004. Kakehashi's book, So Sad to Fall in Battle, found its way to Clint Eastwood in 2005. Eastwood read it and decided to make a war film in a way Hollywood had never attempted, Tell the entire story from the Japanese side in Japanese, with Japanese actors. He called it Letters from Iwo Jima. In 2006, it was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, the only film about the Pacific War told entirely from the enemy's perspective to ever receive that recognition. To prepare for the film, Eastwood's production team contacted the Kuribayashi family directly. Actor Ken Watanabe, who played Kuribayashi in the film, was given access to the actual letters, the same letters Kakahashi had read to Takako. He read them before every day of shooting. In interviews, Watanabe said he felt he was carrying something that didn't belong to him, something he had to handle carefully. For the first time in decades, the name Kuribayashi was being spoken openly in Japan, not as a defeat to be forgotten, but as a story worth telling. Japanese newspapers ran features about the family. Television programs revisited the battle. A man who had been buried in national silence for 60 years was suddenly everywhere, and the grandson, by then a politician, was asked to answer publicly the question his family had kept quiet for 60 years. Yoshitaka Shindo was born in 1958, Takako's son. He grew up in Kawaguchi, Saitama, an ordinary industrial city outside Tokyo. His father was a civil servant. His mother taught school. A normal middle-class post-war Japanese family, and nobody in that family ever mentioned his grandfather. Not out of shame, but because in Japan in the 1960s and 70s, Iwo Jima was a wound people didn't touch. It was a defeat. 21,000 Japanese dead on an island that didn't stop the Americans from reaching Tokyo. There was nothing to celebrate. The country wanted to move forward, rebuild, join the modern world. The war was a chapter that had closed. Shindo went to Meiji University, studied law, graduated in 1981. He went to work for the city government of Kawaguchi. In 1991, he won a seat on the city council. In 1996, he was elected to the National Diet for the first time, representing Saitama's 2nd District under the Liberal Democratic Party. His colleagues knew who he was, but he rarely mentioned his grandfather in professional settings. In 2006, when Letters from Iwo Jima opened worldwide, the international press started looking for the family. Shindo, by then a senior member of the Diet, had to answer questions about his grandfather in public for the first time. In 2015, for the 75th anniversary of the battle, he traveled to Iwo Jima for the joint American-Japanese memorial service. He stood on the same black volcanic ground where his grandfather had died. Around him were American veterans, men in their 80s and 90s, some of them the last surviving Marines who had fought there. They had come back to the island that had taken so much from them. So had he. Later that year, he sat down with Reuters. He said, "When I was a child, my family almost never mentioned my grandfather. For the Japanese, it was a painful defeat that people wanted to forget." Takako's son, sitting in front of international cameras, saying that he grew up not knowing who his grandfather was. Think about what that means for a moment. The man that Holland Smith called the most dangerous enemy the United States faced in the entire Pacific War, his own grandson grew up in the same city as his grave and didn't know his name. The silence in that family wasn't denial. It was the silence of people trying to survive in a country that had no language yet for what they had lost and what it had meant. In 2012, Shindo was appointed Minister of Internal Affairs and Communications under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Later, Minister of State for Economic and Fiscal Policy under Prime Minister Kishida. 9 times elected to the House of Representatives. But Shindo's story isn't as clean as Manfred Rommel's. The son who became mayor of Stuttgart, received the Jerusalem Medal, and built close friendships with the sons of Patton and Montgomery as symbols of European reconciliation. Shindo is a more complicated figure. He has made repeated visits to Yasukuni Shrine, the memorial that honors Japan's war dead, including men convicted of war crimes, drawing protests from China and South Korea each time he goes. Kuribayashi's grandson is not a simple answer to the question of what war leaves behind. History doesn't move in straight lines, from a father drawing pictures in a Chicago hotel room to a grandson sitting in the Japanese cabinet. Something was passed down, and something was not. Something changed, and something didn't. The grandson of the man who died with no grave on Iwo Jima, serving in the cabinet of a democratic Japan, America's closest ally in Asia. That much is true. The rest is a question every person has to answer for themselves. Iwo Jima today is Japanese territory. The Japan Self-Defense Forces operate a naval air base there, a military built under American supervision after the war, now one of Washington's most important partners in the Pacific. No civilians, no tourists. The island is effectively closed to the outside world. Once a year, American and Japanese veterans gather there for a joint memorial service. Old men, fewer every year, standing on black volcanic ground, looking out at the ocean. No guns, no speeches, just wind and silence. Those ceremonies began in 1985, 40 years after the battle. American Marines and Japanese veterans standing on the same ground where they had tried to kill each other. Some of them had never spoken to a Japanese person since the war. Some of the Japanese had never spoken to an American. They stood together anyway, because it turned out that the only people who fully understood what had happened on that island were the ones who had been there. Kuribayashi's remains are still somewhere beneath that island. 80 years, never found, no grave. The Japanese government has made periodic efforts to locate and identify the remains of soldiers buried on Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi is among those still unaccounted for. The man who drew pictures of Chicago for his son, who wrote to a 9-year-old girl telling her to grow up fast and strong. He has no resting place that anyone can visit. Yoshi sold dried squid in the street and raised 3 children and lived to be 98. Takako grew up and said, "Because of him, I've had a very happy life." Shindo stood on Iwo Jima in 2015, surrounded by American veterans, and answered publicly for the first time about the grandfather his family had kept silent for 60 years. In 1928, Kuribayashi sat alone in a hotel room in Chicago and drew pictures to send home to his son. He had seen America, the factories, the ships, the streets, and he knew Japan could not win that war. He went anyway. There is a Japanese concept, giri, that roughly translates to duty or obligation. But the English word duty doesn't quite capture it. Giri is more personal than that. It's the weight of what you owe to the people and institutions that shaped you, even when honoring that weight costs you everything. Kuribayashi had spent 2 years in America genuinely admiring the country. He knew what Japan was walking into, and he went anyway because the alternative, to refuse, to walk away from what was being asked of him, was something he couldn't bring himself to do. Whether that makes him admirable or tragic is a question every person answers differently. The question isn't why he went. The question is, a man who knew how it would end, who drew pictures of American streets to send home to his children, who stripped his rank insignia and led 300 men into the dark. What was he thinking in that final night? Nobody knows. His body was never found. And the letters from Iwo Jima, people are still reading them, 80 years later.